the night shift custodian. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus Rivera pushed his cleaning cart down the polished corridors of the Naval Academy. It was nearly midnight, and the hallways that bustled with cadets during the day now stood empty and silent. Marcus preferred it this way. The quiet gave him time to think, time to remember, and time to push away the memories that threatened to surface when his hands weren't busy. At 42, Marcus had been working the night custodial shift at the academy for 3 years. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with the same precision he once used to grip aircraft controls. Few people knew that the man who now cleaned these halls had once soared through enemy skies, earning one of the most feared call signs in naval aviation history. Marcus stopped outside Admiral Richardson's office, checking his watch. The Admiral often worked late, but tonight the office was dark. He pulled out his keys and unlocked the door, wheeling his cart inside. The walls were lined with photographs of aircraft carriers, squadron patches, and commendations. Marcus tried not to look at them too closely. They reminded him of a life he'd left behind, a life that had cost him everything that mattered. As he dusted the Admiral's desk, his phone buzzed. A text from his babysitter. "Emma's fever is down. She's sleeping peacefully. Don't worry, Mr. Rivera." Marcus smiled for the first time that night. Emma was his world now. At 8 years old, she was the reason he got up every morning, the reason he worked double shifts when needed, the reason he'd given up everything else. Her mother, Sarah, had died in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving Marcus to raise their daughter alone. The insurance money had run out quickly with medical bills, and his military pension wasn't enough. The custodial job paid the bills and let him be home during the day when Emma needed him. He finished cleaning the Admiral's office and moved on to the next corridor. The trophy cases gleamed under his careful attention, filled with awards and honors from decades of naval excellence. As he worked, Marcus heard footsteps echoing down the hall. It was unusual for anyone to be here this late, but sometimes officers worked through the night on important projects. Admiral Richardson rounded the corner, followed by 2 younger officers. The Admiral was in his 50s. With silver hair and the confident bearing of a man who'd commanded respect his entire career, he was known for his sharp wit and occasional tendency to test the people around him, especially those he perceived as beneath his station. "Evening," Admiral Richardson said, stopping near Marcus. "Working late again, I see." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, continuing to clean without looking up. He'd learned to keep interactions brief and professional. Most officers barely noticed the custodial staff, which suited him fine. "You know," the Admiral said to his companions, his voice carrying a hint of amusement, "I've always wondered about the people who clean up after us. No call signs, no glory, just pushing mops and emptying trash cans. Must be quite a change from whatever you did before this." One of the younger officers, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, chuckled. "Different kind of service, I suppose." Admiral Richardson studied Marcus more closely. "What did you do before this, Rivera? The name tag says Rivera, right?" Marcus straightened up, meeting the Admiral's gaze briefly. "Various jobs, sir. Nothing particularly noteworthy." The Admiral's eyes narrowed slightly. "You carry yourself like military. Army? Marines?" "Navy, sir. But that was a long time ago." "Really? What was your rate?" Marcus hesitated. He'd hoped to avoid this conversation, but the Admiral seemed genuinely curious now. "Aviation, sir." "Pilot?" "Yes, sir." Admiral Richardson's expression shifted to one of mild interest. "Well, well. From the cockpit to the custodial closet. That's quite a career change. What happened? Couldn't handle the pressure?" The comment stung, but Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Life circumstances changed, sir. Family comes first." "Family." The Admiral nodded knowingly. "Yes, that can certainly clip a pilot's wings. Tell me, did you have a call sign? Or were you one of those pilots who never quite made an impression?" Lieutenant Commander Hayes shifted uncomfortably, sensing the conversation taking an uncomfortable turn. The other officer, a young lieutenant, watched silently. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his past pressing down on him. His call sign had once struck fear into enemy pilots across 3 different conflicts. He'd been one of the most decorated naval aviators of his generation before everything fell apart. But that life felt like it belonged to someone else now. "I had a call sign, sir." "Oh? What was it? Something amusing, I bet." "The best call signs usually come from embarrassing moments or personal quirks. Let me guess. Mop? Janitor?" The Admiral chuckled at his own joke. Marcus set down his cleaning supplies and looked directly at the Admiral. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there seconds before. "Lone Eagle, sir." The words hung in the air for a moment. Admiral Richardson's smile faded slightly, but he didn't immediately recognize the significance. "Lone Eagle," he repeated. "Sounds a bit dramatic. Let me think. Was that from some training incident? Or maybe you just thought it sounded cool." Marcus picked up his mop again, wringing it out with deliberate movements. "It came from operational experience, sir." "Operational experience." The Admiral's tone became more condescending. "Right. Well, I'm sure whatever missions you flew in peacetime were very exciting. Probably mostly training runs and air shows." The lieutenant commander cleared his throat. "Sir, maybe we should—" No, this is interesting," Admiral Richardson interrupted. "I'm always fascinated by the stories these old pilots tell. Usually they get more heroic with each telling. So, Lone Eagle, what was your most memorable mission? Escorting cargo planes? Search and rescue?" Marcus continued cleaning, but his movements had become more precise, more controlled. Anyone who'd served with him would have recognized the sign. When Marcus Rivera became very still and very quiet, it usually meant trouble was coming. "I flew fighter missions, sir. Air-to-air combat." "Combat?" The Admiral's eyebrows rose. "Really? Which conflict?" "I don't recall any significant air-to-air engagements in recent years that would require a Lone Eagle." "Multiple conflicts, sir, over the course of 20 years. 20 years? Admiral Richardson exchanged glances with his officers. "Well, that's quite a career. And now here you are, mopping floors. I have to say, the military pension system must not be what it used to be." The dig was intentional, and everyone in the hallway knew it. Marcus straightened up slowly, his hand still on the mop handle. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an edge that made the lieutenant commander take a step back. "The pension is adequate, sir. I work here because it allows me to be home during the day with my daughter. She lost her mother 2 years ago, and she needs me there when she gets home from school." Admiral Richardson's expression softened slightly at the mention of Marcus's loss, but he pressed on. "I'm sorry for your loss, but surely a pilot of your caliber could find something better than this. Unless, of course, there were issues with your service record. Sometimes pilots who can't handle the real pressure of command end up in situations like this." The hallway fell silent except for the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Marcus stood motionless for several seconds, his knuckles white where they gripped the mop handle. The Admiral had just crossed a line that very few people had ever dared to cross. Lieutenant Commander Hayes recognized the danger in Marcus's stillness. He'd served long enough to know what a combat veteran looked like when pushed too far. "Sir," he said quietly, "perhaps we should continue our discussion in your office." But Admiral Richardson was committed to his course now, apparently enjoying what he saw as an opportunity to assert his authority over someone he viewed as beneath him. "No, I'm curious about this. You see, gentlemen," he said to his officers, "this is what happens when people don't live up to their potential. Somewhere along the line, our friend here obviously couldn't cut it at the level where it really mattered. Otherwise, he wouldn't be here pushing a mop at midnight." The words echoed down the empty corridor. Marcus slowly released his grip on the mop, letting it fall against his cart with a soft clatter. He turned to face Admiral Richardson directly, and for the first time, the full weight of his attention was focused on the man who had just questioned his honor, his service, and his sacrifice. When Marcus spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded respect in the most dangerous situations imaginable. "Admiral, with all due respect, you have no idea what you're talking about." The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop several degrees. Admiral Richardson's confident smile wavered slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Excuse me? I said you have no idea what you're talking about, sir." Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. "You're making assumptions about my service, my character, and my choices based on what you see in front of you right now. That's a mistake, sir." "Are you threatening me?" Admiral Richardson's voice rose slightly. "No, sir. I'm simply suggesting that you might want to know who you're talking to before you pass judgment on their service record." The standoff stretched on for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Finally, Admiral Richardson seemed to remember that he was, technically, dealing with an employee who could be fired for insubordination. "I think this conversation is over," he said coldly. "Get back to your work, Rivera, and remember who you're talking to." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know exactly who I'm talking to, sir. The question is whether you know who you're talking to." With that, Marcus picked up his mop and returned to his cleaning, dismissing the Admiral as if he were no longer worth his attention. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, and it infuriated Admiral Richardson in a way that direct confrontation never could. As the three officers walked away, Lieutenant Commander Hayes could be heard saying quietly, "Sir, there was something about that man. Maybe we should look into his background." But Admiral Richardson was too angry to listen to advice. "He's a custodian, Hayes. Whatever he might have been 20 years ago doesn't matter now. Some people rise to meet their potential, and others end up mopping floors. That's just the way the world works." Behind them, Marcus continued his work in silence, but his mind was no longer on the task at hand. The Admiral had awakened something that Marcus had spent 3 years trying to bury. For the first time since Sarah's death, he found himself wondering if it was time to stop hiding from who he used to be. The hallway fell quiet again, but the tension that had filled it lingered in the air like smoke from a recently fired weapon. Marcus Rivera, the man the world had once known as Lone Eagle, finished his shift and went home to check on his sleeping daughter, but the careful balance he'd maintained for 3 years had been disturbed. Admiral Richardson had just made the kind of mistake that would have gotten him killed in combat. He had underestimated his enemy, and he was about to learn that some people are far more dangerous than they appear to be on the surface. The man who had once earned the most feared call sign in naval aviation was still there, hidden beneath the custodian's uniform, and he was beginning to remember exactly what that meant. The investigation Lieutenant Commander Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As he sat in his office the next morning, nursing his second cup of coffee, he kept thinking about the custodian from the night before. Marcus Rivera had carried himself like a warrior, not like someone who had failed at military service. The way he'd held himself when challenged, the controlled precision of his movements, and most importantly, the quiet authority in his voice when he'd finally pushed back against Admiral Richardson's taunts. Hayes had served for 15 years and had seen enough combat veterans to recognize one when he met him. Marcus Rivera was no washout. If anything, he reminded Hayes of the most dangerous pilots he'd ever known, the ones who were so confident in their abilities that they never needed to prove anything to anyone. Unable to concentrate on his paperwork, Hayes decided to do something that Admiral Richardson would probably consider insubordination. He was going to look into Marcus Rivera's service record. The initial search through the personnel database yielded basic information. Marcus Rivera, age 42. Navy veteran with 20 years of service. Honorable discharge 3 years ago. The record showed he'd been a naval aviator with multiple deployments, but the details were largely classified. That in itself was unusual. Most service records had at least some publicly accessible information, but Rivera's file was locked down tight. Hayes frowned at his computer screen. He had higher clearance than most officers at his level, but even with his access codes, large portions of Rivera's file remained blacked out. What he could see was intriguing enough: commendations for valor, multiple combat deployments, advanced fighter qualifications, and a progression through ranks that showed exceptional performance. But it was the call sign that made Hayes sit up straight in his chair. Lone Eagle. He'd heard that name before, but he couldn't place where. It nagged at him like a song he could almost remember but couldn't quite identify. Hayes picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been his squadron commander during his deployment to the Mediterranean, and she had an encyclopedic knowledge of naval aviation history and legends. Mitchell! Sarah, it's Tom Hayes. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Hayes, good to hear from you. What's going on? You sound like you're working on something. I am, and I need your help. Have you ever heard of a naval aviator with the call sign Lone Eagle? The silence on the other end of the line stretched on so long that Hayes wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Mitchell's voice came back, but it was completely different. Hushed, almost reverent. Jesus, Tom, where did you hear that name? So you know it? Know it. Every naval aviator worth their wings knows that call sign. Lone Eagle is a legend. Why are you asking about him? Hayes felt his pulse quicken. What can you tell me about him? Not much that isn't classified, but the stories that are public record. Tom, this guy was the real deal. The kind of pilot who comes along maybe once in a generation. His official record shows over 200 combat missions across 3 different conflicts. But the unofficial stories, they're the kind of things that sound too incredible to be true. Like what? Like single-handedly taking on a formation of 6 enemy fighters and downing 4 of them before the others retreated. Like flying a damaged aircraft for over 300 miles through hostile territory to save his wingman. Like being shot down twice and escaping enemy capture both times. The guy was practically invincible. Hayes was scribbling notes as fast as he could write. What happened to him? Why don't we hear about him anymore? That's the thing, Tom. About 3 years ago, he just disappeared. One day he was commanding one of the most elite fighter squadrons in the Navy, and the next day he was gone. Honorable discharge, but nobody talks about why. Some people say he had a family crisis. Others think he was burned out from too many combat deployments. But Tom, why are you asking about this? Hayes took a deep breath. Because I think I met him last night. What? That's impossible. Lone Eagle would be commanding a carrier strike group by now, not... Wait, where did you meet him? He's working as a custodian at the Naval Academy. The silence this time was even longer. When Mitchell spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. A custodian? Tom, are you absolutely sure? He told Admiral Richardson his call sign was Lone Eagle. And Sarah, everything about this guy screams elite pilot. The way he moves, the way he holds himself, the way he handled Richardson's harassment. This is no ordinary janitor. Richardson was harassing Lone Eagle? Mitchell's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. What kind of harassment? Hayes quickly explained the previous night's encounter, including Admiral Richardson's condescending comments about Rivera's service and his suggestion that Rivera couldn't handle the pressure of real military service. Oh, that's bad, Mitchell said when Hayes finished. That's really, really bad. Tom, you need to understand something. Lone Eagle isn't just any pilot. He's the kind of guy that other combat pilots look up to. If Richardson was questioning his service record, his competence, his honor, Well, let's just say that Lone Eagle has never been known for backing down from a fight. What should I do? Find out everything you can about why he left the Navy. And Tom? Be very careful around Admiral Richardson for the next few days. If he really did humiliate Lone Eagle in front of witnesses, this isn't over. Hayes hung up the phone with his mind racing. He looked at his computer screen again, staring at the heavily redacted service record of Marcus Rivera. What kind of family crisis could have forced a legend like Lone Eagle to give up flying? And more importantly, what was he planning to do about Admiral Richardson's insults? The answer to the first question came later that afternoon, when Hayes managed to access personnel files from 3 years ago. The death certificate was brief and tragic. Sarah Rivera, age 36, killed in an automobile accident, survived by husband Marcus and daughter Emma, age 5. Hayes stared at the document, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Marcus Rivera hadn't left the Navy because he couldn't handle the pressure. He'd left because his wife died and he had a 5-year-old daughter who needed him. The man who had once been the most feared pilot in the Navy had given up everything to be a single father. And Admiral Richardson had mocked him for it. Hayes was still processing this information when his phone rang. It was Admiral Richardson's aide, asking him to report to the Admiral's office immediately. When Hayes arrived, he found Admiral Richardson pacing behind his desk, clearly agitated. The morning's bravado had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like concern. "Hayes, I need you to do something for me. I want you to look into the background of that custodian from last night. Rivera." "Sir?" "Something about that conversation has been bothering me. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke to me. I want to make sure we're not dealing with some kind of security risk." Hayes kept his expression neutral. "What kind of security risk, sir?" "I don't know. Maybe he's mentally unstable. Former military personnel sometimes have issues adjusting to civilian life. The way he challenged me last night, it wasn't normal behavior for custodial staff." "I see. And what would you like me to do if I find concerning information?" Admiral Richardson stopped pacing and looked directly at Hayes. "If there's anything in his background that suggests he might be dangerous or unstable, I want him fired immediately." "We can't have someone like that working around naval cadets." Hayes nodded slowly. "I'll look into it, sir." "Good. And Hayes, I want this done quickly and quietly. I don't want word getting around that we're investigating our own custodial staff. It could cause morale issues." As Hayes left the Admiral's office, he realized that Admiral Richardson was scared. The confident, condescending officer from the night before had been replaced by someone who was clearly worried about potential consequences. Richardson might not know who Lone Eagle was, but his instincts were telling him that he'd made a serious mistake. Hayes spent the rest of the afternoon making phone calls and pulling strings to access more detailed information about Marcus Rivera's service record. What he found painted a picture of a man who was not only an exceptional pilot, but also a natural leader and tactical genius. The reports from Rivera's commanding officers read like something out of a war movie. Exceptional courage under fire. Tactical innovation that saved countless lives. The kind of officer who inspires absolute loyalty in his subordinates. Recommended for promotion to squadron command ahead of schedule. But it was a psychological evaluation from Rivera's last deployment that really caught Hayes' attention. The Navy psychiatrist had noted that Rivera showed signs of extreme stress and exhaustion from prolonged combat exposure. The evaluation recommended immediate leave and counseling, noting that Rivera had been pushing himself beyond normal human limits for months. The date of the evaluation was 3 weeks before Sarah Rivera's death. Hayes leaned back in his chair, finally understanding the full picture. Marcus Rivera hadn't just been dealing with the loss of his wife. He'd been struggling with combat fatigue when the accident happened. The combination of losing his wife and being burned out from years of high-stress missions had led to his decision to leave the Navy entirely. But the man who emerged from that tragedy wasn't broken. He'd simply redirected his priorities. Instead of protecting his country, he was protecting his daughter. Instead of leading a squadron, he was being a father. It wasn't a failure or a retreat from duty. It was a conscious choice to put family first. As Hayes was putting together his report, his computer chimed with an incoming secure message. The sender was Captain Mitchell, and the subject line made his blood run cold. Urgent Lone Eagle Intel. The message was brief. Tom, I've been asking around about Lone Eagle's departure from the Navy. Word is that he left after his wife's death, but there's more to the story. Sources say he was offered early promotion to Admiral if he'd stay. He turned it down to raise his daughter. Also hearing rumors that he's been living under the radar, avoiding military events and publicity. If Richardson humiliated him publicly, this could get very ugly very fast. Lone Eagle has friends throughout the Navy, including some at very high levels. Be careful. Hayes stared at the message, feeling the weight of what he'd learned settling on his shoulders. Admiral Richardson hadn't just insulted a custodian. He'd publicly humiliated a war hero who had sacrificed a Star Trek career to be a single father. And if Mitchell was right about Rivera having friends in high places, Richardson's career could be in serious jeopardy. The question now was what Hayes should include in his report. The truth would probably end Admiral Richardson's career and might restore Marcus Rivera to his rightful place in the Navy hierarchy. But it would also destroy the quiet life that Rivera had built for himself and his daughter. As Hayes sat in his office, weighing his options, he received a text message from an unknown number. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, this is Marcus Rivera. We need to talk. Hayes stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, when and where? The response came immediately. Tonight, 2200 hours, Pier 7. Come alone. Hayes deleted the messages and looked out his office window at the gathering dusk. In a few hours, he would meet with one of the most legendary pilots in naval history. And somehow, he suspected that Admiral Richardson's comfortable world was about to be turned upside down. The investigation was over. Now came the reckoning. The confrontation. The fog rolled in from Chesapeake Bay as Lieutenant Commander Hayes made his way to Pier 7. At 2200 hours, the waterfront was deserted except for the occasional security patrol. Hayes found Marcus Rivera standing at the end of the pier, looking out over the dark water. Even in civilian clothes, Rivera carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. Thank you for coming, Rivera said without turning around. I know this is unusual. Hayes approached cautiously. You wanted to talk. I know you've been investigating me. Rivera turned to face him, and in the dim light from the pier lamps, Hayes could see the calm intensity that had made him legendary. Admiral Richardson asked you to look into my background. How did you... I still have friends in the system. People who keep an eye out for certain searches. Rivera's voice was matter-of-fact. What did you find? Hayes took a deep breath. I found out that Admiral Richardson made a serious mistake last night. Tell me what you learned. I know who you are, the real you, Lone Eagle, 200 combat missions, Medal of Honor recipient, squadron commander at 35. You were being fast-tracked for Admiral before you left the Navy. Rivera nodded slowly. And why did I leave? Your wife died. You had a 5-year-old daughter who needed her father more than the Navy needed another admiral. That's right. Rivera was quiet for a moment, watching the water. Sarah was everything to me. When she died, I had a choice. I could continue serving my country and let someone else raise my daughter, or I could be the father she needed. The choice was easy. So why are we here? Hayes asked. What do you want from me? I want you to understand something. Last night, Admiral Richardson questioned my honor, my service, and my courage in front of witnesses. In the military, that's not just an insult. It's a challenge. Hayes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. What are you planning to do? I'm planning to remind the Admiral who he was talking to. Rivera, think about this. You have a daughter to consider. Getting into a confrontation with Richardson could what? Rivera turned to face him fully. Cost me my job mopping floors? Hayes, I gave up a career that most officers only dream of to raise my daughter. Do you think I'm worried about losing a custodial position? Then what is this about? Rivera was quiet for a long moment before answering. It's about respect, not for me, but for every service member who's ever had to make hard choices. Richardson saw a man in a custodian's uniform and assumed that meant he was a failure, someone who couldn't cut it at the highest levels. That kind of thinking is dangerous. So this is about proving a point? This is about teaching a lesson. Rivera's voice carried the authority Hayes remembered from the night before. Hayes, I need you to deliver a message to Admiral Richardson. What message? Tell him that tomorrow night at 2100 hours, I'll be waiting in Conference Room Alpha. Tell him I want to discuss my service record with him, privately. Hayes shook his head. Rivera, this is a bad idea. Richardson outranks you. Hell, technically you're a civilian now. He could have you arrested. For what? Requesting a meeting? Rivera smiled, but there was no humor in it. Besides, I don't think the Admiral will want to make this a legal matter, not once he understands what he's dealing with. You're asking me to set up a confrontation that could end badly for both of you. I'm asking you to deliver a message. What happens after that is between Richardson and me. Hayes studied Rivera's face in the lamplight. The man was completely calm, showing no signs of anger or aggression. But there was something in his eyes that reminded Hayes of a predator patiently stalking prey. Why should I help you? Because you know I'm right. Because you've read my service record, and you know that Richardson was completely out of line last night. And because sometimes good officers need to stand up to bad ones. Hayes considered his options. He could refuse to deliver the message and hope the situation would resolve itself. He could report the conversation to his superiors and let them handle it. Or he could trust his instincts about Marcus Rivera and see where this led. What exactly are you planning to do in that meeting? I'm planning to have a conversation about respect, service, and the difference between real leadership and empty authority. That's not an answer. Rivera looked back out over the water. Hayes, I've spent 20 years in situations where the wrong decision could get people killed. I've commanded men in combat, made split-second choices under fire, and lived with the consequences. Admiral Richardson has spent his career managing budgets and attending meetings. Tomorrow night he's going to learn the difference. Despite his misgivings, Hayes found himself nodding. I'll deliver the message. Thank you. But Rivera, if this goes sideways, if anyone gets hurt— No one will get hurt, Rivera interrupted. This isn't about violence, it's about truth. The next morning, Hayes found himself standing outside Admiral Richardson's office, trying to figure out how to deliver Rivera's message without ending his own career. He'd spent most of the night thinking about the conversation on the pier, and he'd come to the conclusion that Marcus Rivera was planning something that would either be brilliant or catastrophic. Come in, Admiral Richardson called when Hayes knocked. The Admiral looked tired and stressed. His usually immaculate uniform was slightly wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Do you have that report on Rivera? Yes, sir, but first I have a message for you. Richardson looked up sharply. A message? From whom? From Marcus Rivera. He wants to meet with you tonight at 2100 hours in Conference Room Alpha. He says he wants to discuss his service record. The color drained from Admiral Richardson's face. He wants to what? Meet with you. Privately. He was very specific about the time and place. Richardson stood up abruptly and began pacing. This is harassment. I could have him arrested. For requesting a meeting? For... Richardson stopped pacing and stared at Hayes. What did you find in his background check? Hayes opened the folder he'd prepared. Marcus Rivera, call sign Lone Eagle, served 20 years in the Navy with distinction. Multiple combat deployments, numerous commendations for valor, Medal of Honor recipient, promoted to squadron commander ahead of schedule. Medal of Honor? Richardson's voice was barely a whisper. For actions during Operation Northern Shield. The citation reads, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. He saved 12 lives that day, sir. This can't be right. He's a custodian. He left the Navy 3 years ago after his wife's death to raise his daughter as a single parent. He was offered early promotion to Admiral if he would stay. He declined. Admiral Richardson sank into his chair, his face pale. Jesus Christ, what have I done? Sir, I called a Medal of Honor recipient a washout. I suggested he couldn't handle the pressure of real military service, in front of witnesses. Richardson put his head in his hands. My career is over. Hayes waited silently while the Admiral processed the information. What does he want? Richardson asked finally. He says he wants to discuss his service record with you. That's all? That's what he told me. Richardson was quiet for a long moment. Hayes, I need you to understand something. If this gets out, if word spreads that I humiliated a Medal of Honor recipient... I understand, sir. Do you think he's planning to ruin me? Hayes considered his answer carefully. Sir, I think Marcus Rivera could have ruined you yesterday if that's what he wanted. The fact that he's requesting a private meeting suggests he wants to handle this quietly. Or he wants to threaten me in private. Respectfully, sir, if Marcus Rivera wanted to threaten you, I don't think he'd need privacy to do it. Admiral Richardson stared at the file on his desk. What kind of man gives up a Star Trek career to mop floors? A man who puts his family first, sir. And now I've insulted him for it. Richardson stood up slowly. Hayes, I want you to attend this meeting. Sir, I want a witness to whatever Rivera has to say. Someone who can verify that I handled this appropriately. Hayes nodded. Yes, sir. At 2100 hours that evening, Admiral Richardson and Lieutenant Commander Hayes entered Conference Room Alpha to find Marcus Rivera already waiting. He was dressed in a simple business suit instead of his custodial uniform, and the transformation was remarkable. The tired-looking janitor had been replaced by someone who radiated quiet authority. Admiral, Rivera said, standing as they entered, thank you for coming. Richardson seemed to have aged years since the morning. Rivera, I want to start by saying, please sit down, sir. Rivera's voice was calm but commanding. We have several things to discuss. Richardson sat down heavily, with Hayes taking a chair slightly behind him. Rivera remained standing, and Hayes realized that the positioning was intentional. Rivera was conducting this meeting like a military briefing, with himself in command. Admiral, 2 nights ago you made several statements about my character, my service, and my fitness as a military officer. I want to address those statements. Rivera, I owe you an apology. You called me a washout. You suggested I couldn't handle the pressure of real military service. You implied that my current job was evidence of personal failure. Rivera's voice never rose above conversational level, but each word hit like a hammer blow. Those statements were inaccurate. Richardson nodded miserably. I know that now. I've seen your record. Have you? Let me tell you what's not in my record, Admiral. Rivera began pacing slowly around the table, his movement controlled and precise. My record doesn't show the nightmares I still have about the men I couldn't save. It doesn't show the guilt I carry about missions where good people died because of decisions I made. It doesn't show the toll that 20 years of combat takes on a man's soul. He stopped directly in front of Richardson. My record shows that I flew 200 combat missions. It doesn't show that I came home from each one changed, harder, more distant from the people I loved. It doesn't show that my wife used to lie awake at night worrying that someday I wouldn't come home at all. Richardson was staring at the table, unable to meet Rivera's eyes. When Sarah died, Admiral, I had already lost pieces of myself in cockpits over 3 different war zones. I had a choice: continue serving and lose what was left of my humanity, or step away and try to be the father my daughter needed. Rivera's voice softened slightly. I chose my daughter, and I've never regretted that choice for a single moment. I understand, Richardson said quietly. Do you? Because 2 nights ago, you saw a man in a custodian's uniform and assumed he was there because he'd failed at something else. You never considered that he might be there by choice. You never considered that some things are more important than rank or prestige or career advancement? Rivera returned to his seat, but his posture remained commanding. Admiral, I didn't request this meeting to humiliate you or to threaten your career. I requested it because I wanted you to understand something important. What's that? The people you lead, the people who serve under you, all have stories. All have made sacrifices. All have chosen duty over personal comfort at some point in their lives. When you dismiss someone based on their current circumstances without knowing their story, you dishonor their service. Richardson finally looked up to meet Rivera's eyes. You're right. I was completely out of line. Yes, you were. But more importantly, you were wrong. Service isn't measured by the uniform someone wears or the office they occupy. It's measured by the sacrifices they're willing to make for something bigger than themselves. Rivera stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. I've been watching the cadets at the academy, Admiral. They're good kids, most of them. They're eager to serve, eager to prove themselves. Some of them will go on to have distinguished careers. Others will face setbacks, make hard choices, deal with personal tragedies that change their paths. He looked directly at Richardson. When that happens, I hope they serve under officers who judge them by their character and their service, not by their circumstances. I hope they serve under leaders who understand that sometimes the hardest duty is stepping away from what you love to do what's necessary. Richardson stood up as well, his demeanor completely different from the confident officer who had mocked Rivera 2 nights earlier. Rivera, I want to formally apologize for my comments. They were inappropriate and completely unfounded. Apology accepted, Admiral. Is there anything I can do to make this right? Rivera considered the question for a moment. Actually, there is. The Academy's custodial staff works hard and takes pride in maintaining this facility. They're good people doing important work. Perhaps you could remember that the next time you encounter someone you think is beneath your notice. I will. You have my word. Rivera nodded and moved toward the door. Then I think we're finished here. Rivera, Richardson called after him. If you ever want to return to active duty, I'd be happy to make some calls. Your country could still use someone like you. Rivera paused at the door. Thank you, Admiral. But I already have the most important job in the world. I'm Emma's father, and she still needs me. After Rivera left, Admiral Richardson and Hayes sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, the Admiral spoke. Hayes, I want you to write up a report on this incident. What should I include? Sir, that I made a serious error in judgment regarding a member of our support staff, that the matter has been resolved through direct communication, and that all personnel should remember that everyone who works at this facility deserves our respect, regardless of their position. Hayes nodded. Yes, sir. And Hayes, not a word about Rivera's background to anyone. The man deserves his privacy. Understood, sir. As they left the conference room, Admiral Richardson felt like he'd just received the most important education of his career. He'd learned that true strength sometimes looked like humility, that real leadership meant putting others first, and that the most dangerous mistake any officer could make was underestimating the people around him. 3 days later, Admiral Richardson was making his rounds through the academy when he encountered Marcus Rivera cleaning in one of the hallways. The Admiral stopped and waited for Rivera to notice him. "Good evening, Rivera." "Good evening, Admiral. How's your daughter doing?" Rivera smiled, the first genuine smile Richardson had seen from him. "She's doing great, sir. Made the honor roll this semester." "That's wonderful. You should be proud." "I am, sir." As Richardson walked away, he felt a profound sense of respect for the man who had chosen love over glory, family over fame. Marcus Rivera might mop floors for a living now, but he was still every inch the warrior who had once been known as Lone Eagle. And Admiral Richardson would never again make the mistake of judging someone's worth by their current circumstances rather than their character. Some lessons he had learned are worth learning the hard way.